So it looks like I'm sitting in the middle. I hope we don't have any scores to settle or anything like that today. Welcome back, everyone, from the coffee break. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Ryan Heath, and I'm the Senior EU Correspondent for Politico, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this ministerial chat with two fascinating thinkers and decision makers who I think you all know quite well. So first of all, we have First Vice President Frans Timmermans from the European Commission, who I don't think it's an exaggeration to say is the most powerful non-president that we've had in the Commission's history. So we're all looking forward to what he has to say. And then, of course, from our host government, the Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic, Lubomír Zaorálek, who has got some very interesting developments in his life, which we won't cover in this session, but I'll take it as a good luck charm. You came here yesterday, Minister, and just a couple of hours later, you were made the prime ministerial candidate for your party. So I think it's a very good luck charm to be here. Now, both speakers have requested to make opening remarks, so of course we'll respect those wishes. But one thing I will say on behalf of the audience is audiences tend to love conversations more than they like speeches. So I will encourage it to be a mix. So if we can make sure there's time for you two to have a conversation with each other, find out what common ground there is on the topics of the day, everyone in the room will really appreciate that. And to get you all started on a positive note, you also have the opportunity to ask questions via the Slido system, so please make sure they're topics of mutual and European interest rather than domestic issues. And then I'll remind everyone about a fascinating topic of an infringement decision on Wednesday, and it's not the one you're thinking of. On Wednesday, the Czech Republic and the Netherlands were both asked to fully comply with the directive of energy performance in buildings. And so I leave that as a reminder that there are lots of times when lots of people fall short of EU standards, and the most important thing is that we have a really good discussion when that happens. So on that note, Minister Zaorálek, I invite you to make your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy that I can again welcome Frans Timmermans in Prague to our Prague European Summit. With Frans, we have here someone who is not only the Vice President of the European Commission, but also someone who is deeply concerned about what is going on in Europe and who makes significant political and intellectual effort to overcome the challenges we are facing. For example, his recent book on brotherhood provides a remarkable contribution to the reflection of our European condition. Several times I had opportunity to discuss with Frans about what is good and what is wrong in Europe. We agreed on many things, and maybe we can also discuss many things. However, at least for me, these have always been fruitful intellectual exchanges that help me progress on understanding where we are and what we need to do. To contribute to our reflection on Europe today, I would like to briefly touch upon three recent crises that have been significantly affecting European politics: the debt crisis in the Eurozone, the migration crisis, and the crisis of European social democracy. At the first glance, these three crises do not seem to have much in common. They are about different issues and about different actors. Their dynamics are different and their effects are different. Having said that, I believe that despite all these differences, they also have a quite lot in common. I even argue that their darkest consequences can be brought to a single common denominator. The common denominator of the European social question, which has been neglected and ignored for too long a time. I am not going to review all the elements of each of the crises. I would rather like to show that each is linked with social question and none can be properly tackled without addressing the social question. To start with, as a consequence of the financial crisis in the Eurozone and of the policy responses to it, some countries accumulated huge debts whose repayment is likely to stifle prosperity of debtor countries for many years to come. Eurozone, which all used to see as a community of prosperity, turned into stifling straitjacket for some of its members. Unfortunately, those who suffer most are the most vulnerable people in respective societies: pensioners, single mothers, young people, people who depend on public services. As a result, many of those who originally looked up to Europe were let down and lost any belief in social justice in Europe. Czechia is not a member of the Eurozone, but we do not want to stay out of it forever. However, the Eurozone we want to join is the one which will help us converge with the richer, including the improvement of lives of the most deprived, and not the one which may keep us down. Secondly, most of the problems of the migration crisis have a social background. It is the prosperity of the richest EU countries that has been pulling millions of migrants to Europe for years. Their motivation is understandable. They seek better lives, and they are aware of big differences in the quality of life between the richest and the poorest parts of the European Union. That is why the burden of migrants is so unevenly distributed across Europe, and that is why it is so difficult to achieve a more even distribution of migrants among the EU countries. The newcomers will spread evenly across Europe as soon as the prosperity is spread evenly across the EU. Obviously, they have more opportunities in the richer parts of the EU than they have in the poorer parts of the EU, whose most vulnerable inhabitants are often poorer than the incoming migrants themselves. So the answer lies in the economic and social convergence among the EU countries rather than in the attempts to distribute migrants by imposed quotas as if these people were unmovable objects that will stay where the Commission tells them to. Lastly, in recent years, we have been witnessing a steady erosion of social democratic parties in Europe. I do not speak about this because Frans and myself come from this political family, but I consider it a major crisis because of the key role the moderate left has been having in the liberal democracies. These systems cannot properly function if these democratic forces are replaced by radicals or by amorphous political movements as we witness nowadays. Perhaps we, Social Democrats, are today punished by voters because we forgot why we are here. Namely, to promote justice, to moderate inequalities, to protect the most vulnerable. If we want to convince our citizens that we deserve their trust, we have to convince them that our take on the reform of the Eurozone or on the migration policy is not led by abstract principles, but by the concrete concerns of social justice, of the moderation of inequalities, and of the protection of the most vulnerable members of our societies. I am speaking about crisis, and I am speaking about gloomy things, but I would like to finish that fundamentally I am proud of living in current Europe. I am convinced that it's big advantage and big chance to live in European cities, to have opportunity to utilize the European way of life. Yes, Europe is labyrinth, as Friedrich Nietzsche said and wrote in some of these books, but I'm convinced that this labyrinth, these differences, this multiplicity is part of our mentality and our fate, our destiny. I'm convinced that part of our life is also our ability to be on one side tolerant, also on one side to be able to reflect and to be critical. And I'm convinced that we are able to survive this year 2017. I'm convinced that we are able to manage all this election, and I'm convinced that after this election we have a chance to be strengthened. And I'm also looking forward that after all this election, the new representation will be able to sit around the table and look for ways how to bridge, how to overcome divisions, how to solve differences between South and the West, between South and the North, between East and the West. And I'm convinced that we are able to find a way how to keep together all our family 27. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about our common future. I want to reflect on some of the events that recently impressed me. And I also want to do this against the background of our common past. If we don't know our past, if we don't study it, analyze it, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes made before. If we don't know our past, we can't charter the path forward to the future. And isn't this a symbolic place to reflect on this? I see many people in the audience who are as old as my children, and perhaps even younger than my oldest children. And I also know that in this hall, 76 years ago, Heydrich unveiled his plans of how he would annihilate the Czech nation. And here we are, 3/4 of a century later, the Czech nation stronger than ever in its history, as part of a community of values, which is the European Union, as part of a community of security, which is NATO, and more self-secured, more in charge of its own destiny than ever before in its history, in the same hall with you from all across Europe. Last week, I think the youngest generation that is allowed to vote in the United Kingdom had their Sleeping Beauty moment. They woke up. They woke up and they decided to use the system because they want to change the system. As a professor at university, I was always complaining to my students, telling them, you are the best, the brightest generation in European history. You are healthier, you are smarter, you are better connected. You're true Europeans, not because you like the European Union or its institutions, but because Europe is your natural habitat. And you are not entirely satisfied with this present situation, but you're not dissatisfied enough to do something about it. And I believe the elections in the United States, the vote on Brexit, woke up a new generation to the necessity to be politically active if you want to shape the society of the future. I believe we might now see a young generation taking the responsibility, taking our common future in hand, a generation which I would call post-ideological, but very idealistic, driven by ideals of social justice, of environmental responsibility, of responsibility for our common future, but not in an ideological framework. And my political parties and other political parties will have to wake up to that reality. There is so much idealism in society, especially with the younger generation, but do not frame them in an ideology. They don't feel comfortable with that. But they are awake to new ideals, and they understand that you need to become active to defend these ideals. Why do we see young people in Europe now going to the streets to defend Europe? Because arguably for the first time in a long time we've seen that it is correct and right to criticize Europe because of its failings. But now we also understand that the European construction is not unbreakable. Our values might be self-evident They are not self-executing. And it takes coming together, it takes political awareness and it takes activity to defend the European Union. It could break down if we don't stand up for it. It is my deep conviction that there is a silent majority, huge majority of Europeans, young and old, all generations, who still believe that with all its faults, the European Union is the best instrument we have at hand to shape our collective future. Just look at what's happening globally. The part Europe has in the world's economy is shrinking and will continue to shrink. The part Europe has in the world's population is continuing to shrink. And at the same time, we are in pole position to shape some of the most important decisions of the world community's future. The Paris Agreement rests in our hands. We can make sure it is a success if we act united as Europeans. Others will follow. Others in Asia and others worldwide are looking for European leadership now that American leadership seems to be wanting. Even many in the United States, at the level of states, at the level of communities, cities, are willing to work with us. Pitting Pittsburgh against Paris was perhaps not the smartest move, since the people in Pittsburgh want exactly the same as the people in Paris. That is a responsible policy to assure our common future. So what does that mean for our European cooperation? And I'll end on that. Sure, we have disagreements. Sure, we need to come together to sort them out. And sure, sometimes these disagreements go to the very heart of the nature of European integration, of the rule of law, for instance, or of shared responsibility for shared problems. Sure. But all these disagreements are nothing compared with the strength of our common destiny, of the need to shape our common destiny together. Of course, migration is perceived differently across the European Union. Of course, the issue of integration is perceived differently in countries that have no experience whatsoever with integration, and other countries that have experience, good and bad, with integration and still need to learn. But only together will we solve these problems. And I count on the younger generation, now that it is awoken politically and has expressed its wishes in the British elections, I count on them to do the same in other elections and to become more active also in defending our common European project. There's a lot to do. The world will change regardless of what we do. The fundamental question is, will this change be done by others and just we suffer the consequences, or will we be the shapers of that change to the benefit of every single European? Let's try and do the best for your generation and next generations, which in my view is shaping the world together as fellow Europeans. Thank you very much.
Now, I understand both of you had lunch together before you came here. Did you discuss the refugee relocation issue? Would you like to tell us a bit of what went on over the lunch table?
The honest answer is we didn't. We discussed many things, but not that issue. But I'm willing to discuss it here if you wish. What we're doing, what we need to do is to find a sustainable solution that can be supported by all member states for crisis situations. And the starting position of the Commission is that it cannot be the case that if there is a crisis situation with many, many refugees and migrants coming to Europe, that just because they arrive in one or two member states, the responsibility to deal with that resides only with these one or two member states. That, I think, is highly unfair in a community of values that is based on collective solidarity. Now, if we accept that premise, and if we also make sure that everyone does what we've agreed in terms of external border protection, in terms of having agreements with the countries of origin or the countries of transit, in terms of making sure that people return if they don't have the right to international protection. If we do all that, then surely we need to be able to find a solution for sharing the burden in a crisis situation when all of a sudden many, many more people arrive than can be handled by one or two member states alone. And this is what I hope we can look for at the next European Council and then work further on finding solutions. The issue at hand now with the decision that was not yet implemented by a number of member states is a decision taken in full accordance with EU law in the previous crisis in 2015, and we need to execute that. And I think it is only fair that if we are, as Commission, guardians of the treaty, and we need to make sure that member states actually also implement decisions taken lawfully, that we then also, take member states to task if they do not want yet to do that. But that's not the main point. For me, the main point is that we have a collective responsibility to find a sustainable solution in a migration crisis if there are unreasonable amounts, huge amounts of people arriving in one or two member states, and that we find ways of sharing the burden of that if such a crisis would occur again.
One quick follow-up, and then I promise we will get a response in. There were 13 relocation reports, or reports into this system of refugee relocation before the action taken on Wednesday. Could you share us a little bit of insight into why now? Why at this point was the decision taken?
Well, there's probably never a good moment or a bad moment. The thing is, we've been having this discussion for a long, long time, and we had a lot of criticism from quite a number of member states that we took so long. And the reason why I waited as long as I could to give you a completely open and honest answer is I thought going into a procedure of infringement that's a lengthy process, and I hoped that we could find a solution before having to take that step, a political solution. But sadly, it wasn't to be found. So then the Commission has no other option. But I tried to do this at the latest possible occasion, and I think we had no more time left. We needed to act now.
Lubomír, Zaorálek, was there a moment where the Czech Republic decided to stop following the rules? When did that happen? It's been more than a year now since you made an offer to relocate refugees.
Yeah. Maybe our firm stance now has some concrete reason, because Czech Republic was ready to try to the pilot voluntary relocation scheme, but proceeding to adopt the mandatory relocation scheme without a preliminary analysis was a hasty move. And we are convinced that we had got no right analysis of this first pilot program, and from our side we raised many technical issues and technical technical arguments why we are convinced that it's very difficult to guarantee security. For example, that we are not able to make really perfect and enough security procedures to know that we really know who we are receiving. We raised many issues. For example, that we have feeling that people which are coming have no real interest to be integrated, because they are looking for visit places when they are living with partners from similar cultural, ethnic, religious background. And from the beginning, we have feeling that in this country they have no interest to be really integrated. And in Czech Republic, I would like to stress, we were able in 2016 receive 30,000 people and migrants, mainly from east part of our neighborhood. I would like also to recall that during 90s in Czech Republic we received 40,000 of refugees from Yugoslavia during Yugoslavia war. I would like to recall that in this time nobody was interested about the religious background and ethnicity of these people, because it was no similar experience with atrocities as we saw in last years in Nice and Belgium and France and I feel sorry, many other countries in Europe. And it's very difficult to explain people in our country that we have to feel obliged to repeat the mistakes of the West countries. When in these countries we saw suburbs around the capitals, suburbs full of thousands of people which are living in very unperfect living condition, very limited security. And that in these countries we saw there are people which are, or there are cities when you have relatively safe segments of the cities, but at the same time you have parts where it's very risky to go not only in night but also during the day. And it's very difficult to explain people that here in Czech Republic we have accept something like mandatory quotas or any automatic mechanism, which could mean for the future that in our country, in a relatively small country, we can wait that we can have in some years similar suburbs and similar parts of the country when will be no security guaranteed, and we will repeat something which we can see in Washington, United States, Latin America, but also in European countries.
Well, if there was a better functioning system, you would be willing to accept this system that you signed up to at the council? If there were better...
I would like to tell that what we are raising now is mainly incentive and signal that we are ready to discuss these things, discuss this deeply with our partners in Europe. I am very glad that last week when I had opportunity to meet also with Jean-Claude Juncker, the result of this discussion, Jean-Claude told me that it is a must. If I came to Brussels, if I will come to Brussels the next time, it would be appropriate to continue this discussion. But we are ready to elaborate letter, we are ready to elaborate some materials, and we are ready also to discuss frankly these things also with partners in Brussels, with representatives of the Commission. So it seems to me that I agree with many things which Frans said, and I absolutely agree that we have to find common solution. We have to find new asylum system in Europe, but at the same time, what we need also from European and Commission side to be patient and to be willing to listen and to accept also our proposals. I am not able probably to outline the result, but my position is that I feel obliged to lead the policy of consensus and compromise. And when we are facing crisis, it's probably very difficult to find this consensus and compromise, but we are ready to look for this compromise, and it's only way how to solve the situation.
That is a perfect moment to bring in our audience. Martin Michelot has a question, which is, what role can the Czech Republic play in acting as a bridging power to facilitate discussions with Hungary and Poland over rule of law issues? Does Prague desire this role? I'll actually turn to you first, Mr. Timmermans, because you are in the thick of this Polish issue, as you are many others. Can you see a role for the Czech Republic in helping you and the EU out of these difficult discussions that you're now in with Poland?
Well, that of course is not for me to say. I have a bilateral discussion with Poland, a bilateral discussion with Hungary. I have no inclination whatsoever to turn that into a multilateral V4 discussion. There's no reason to do that. But I do understand that there is a willingness of both Poland, or a strong incentive for both Poland and Hungary, to work strongly in the V4 Visegrad framework, but also to work with the Benelux and to work with others to make sure you stay connected to the dynamics that will follow after the German election, from the cooperation between Paris and Berlin. Things will be moving in in Europe as of, let's say, the end of September, beginning of October. Moving very fast, I assume. And in that context, of course, the Visegrad have all the interest to work together to shape our common future. But I'm not calling on others to be involved in this. This is really a bilateral issue where the Commission, as guardian of the treaty, has a very specific role to play. And I intend to continue playing that role because I believe, you know, if we don't have the rule of law, then it's very difficult to conceive of a Europe that can be maintained according to the treaties as we have it now.
I'll grant you're 99% correct, but now that we've moved the discussion to the Council as well, it's also beyond the Commission, everyone else is involved. Minister.
Thank you for this question. I'm convinced that the Visegrad Group was a splendid idea of Václav Havel 25 years ago. And I am decided to keep this idea and to keep this community. But it's true that it's not easy. But I said I'm on the side of consensus and compromise, but you know that sometimes it's difficult to find compromise. I would like to recall one concrete point. It was discussion about Donald Tusk, for example, in last time, and I remember how it was difficult, the discussion with my Polish counterpart, especially about this item, and I felt very sorry that we were not able to have consensus on this especially important issue, because I was convinced that Donald Tusk is not only the right man as a head of European Council, but it was really man who was able to help us, also willing to understand and willing to participate and cooperate with Central East European countries. And I felt very sorry that it was impossible to have consensus about this very important issue. And I remember that I said to my Polish colleague that if we will lose this post, I am convinced that there will be no chance to gain this post in after the election. And for us, it was very important to have on so high level in European institution somebody who is the member of this Visegrad community. But I'm speaking about it only because on one side I am very clear that and decided that we have to keep this gathering. On the other side, we have concrete examples that we were not able to find consensus on very important issue. And but after this, I feel obliged to continue to look for these compromises and consensus. It seems to me that it's very important to show that we are able to cooperate and communicate here in Central East Europe, and we have to look for partners. And I'm convinced that also in Poland, that also in the future, we will be able to find partners, Democrats, and there is no other option. And that's why I'm convinced that here in Central East Europe, it's our concrete commitment to the future of Europe that we have to show that we are able to help create, also, as I said, after all this election 2017, I hope that we will be able to participate on this important discussion about the future face of Europe.
Thank you. Now let's move to one of the easy questions. To both panelists, one, what is the biggest problem of the EU? And two, how do you personally propose to be part of the solution?
I think the biggest problem of the EU is what I would call moral hazard. The fact that people in the north believe that people in the south retire at 50 and go to the beach every day at the expense of people in the north, and people in the south believe that people in the north have a perverse pleasure in imposing austerity on them, which is absolutely unnecessary, but they do it because they like to do it. And people in the west thinking that people in the east gladly accept their taxpayers' money in the structural funds, but are not willing to do anything if in the West we are suffering with the refugee crisis, and people in the East who believe that people in the West have a perverse inclination to export the problems they have with the integration of their minorities to Eastern Europe. When I'm saying, I'm giving you 4 complete caricatures of reality. But you should not underestimate how much these caricatures of reality impede the creation of a community based on shared destiny. Because if I have to share my destiny with someone whose motives I don't trust, I will be reluctant to do that. And nationalists and xenophobes, north, south, east, west, prey on that. So the first way of solving this is to show that in certain areas we do share responsibility for a collective future, and we do show that we understand the other's problem. I think it would be a great asset if there would be more attention in Southern Europe, for instance, for the threat of Russia and what is happening in Eastern Europe. And there would be more attention in Northern and Eastern Europe for the threat Southern European nations feel from the migration pressure coming from Africa and the Arab world. If we would be able to be more sensitive to each other's predicament and be willing to contribute to solving the problem collectively as Europeans, the issue of moral hazard will go down. And only when that issue of moral hazard is within reasonable parameters can we take the next steps in our common future. Because every step we will take from now on in sharing our destiny more closely will entail that we also take collective responsibility for collective problems. And we can only do that if the issue of moral hazard recedes to the background.
Maybe also what I see as the main problem is maybe a little bit similar to what Frans said. It seems to me that the most dangerous thing is that we have tendency to create different narratives about our role in Europe. Different narrative in east part of Europe and different narrative in west part or south and north. It is similar what Frans said. And that, for example, in the west, maybe it could be tendency to say maybe this enlargement, last big enlargement was failure. Maybe in the east, it could be tendency to repeat that it is very problematic, we are discriminated, that this big question if it has some sense for us and so. And maybe to start to say, and these people are different on the east than we in the west, and maybe that is, it seems to me dangerous because it's, I'm deeply convinced that all this rhetoric about big differences are mistaken, because I can show you that problems which we have now in the East are the same problem with the populism which now you can see also in the United States and many West countries. It's nothing which was elaborated here in the East. Maybe it's sometimes, maybe, that's why I would like to stress the similarities which we have between East and the West and South and the North. And maybe if you are also asking me what is my role in this, maybe it's clear, maybe, but I would like to add something more. I'm convinced that what seems to me now very important in Czech Republic, I am deeply convinced that we need open foreign policy. It's prerequisite and precondition for our livelihood, and it's. But on the other hand, after a few years in foreign policy, I know that is very important. If you want to lead open policy, you first of all you have to keep or to have social contract in your country, and to create this social contract in the country, it's preconditioned for this openness for the future. That's why after 3.5 years in foreign policy, I am convinced that it's very important to devote time and energy also to discussion in Czech Republic, to create this fundamental platform for open foreign policy in the future.
Okay, a quick one for you, Mr. Timmermans. Does the Commission agree with President Macron that the door is open to the UK to stay in the EU?
Oh, by all means.
When is that door closing?
Well, we didn't ask the UK to leave. They decided to leave. They've notified that they will leave. I think in a couple of days' time it will be a year ago since they had the referendum, and we're anxious to know how they want to leave. So that's the process we're in right now. And I frankly believe they will continue with that, and they will leave. But if at any time they would say, hang on, we've reconsidered, we'd like to stay, I would receive them with open arms.
All the way up until 2019?
Well, it's up to them.
Article 50 clock
it's
goes
up to them. It's entirely up to them.
That's good. That's a very open answer. Now, picking up on the previous point, that there might be commonalities of the populist forces that governments or the center have to face, whether it's East or West, America, somewhere else. What is also true is that it's only countries from Eastern Europe and Central Europe that were part of that infringement procedure yesterday. So is there really a different attitude in Central and Eastern Europe, and is that going to change if you can solidify that social contract and if you can make those arguments on Czech doorsteps over the next generation?
No, I would like to stress that generally I am convinced that it's the must to keep the rules in the European Union, and maybe to using this extraordinary procedure is only instrument how to show that it's very important not to lead and not to run things in Europe in technocratical and bureaucratical way, because it seems to me that is also one of the most dangerous things in Europe, that too often we are speaking about sanctions and judicial courts, but I'm convinced that in the time of the crisis, we have to be able to accept this crisis as incentive for political solutions and political discussions, and that there's a must to look for political compromises. I can imagine that it's possible to push this idea of quotas and mandatory quotas and automatic mechanism for migration like something which could be solved by majority voting and then sanctions. And so it seems to me that because now we not only in Czech Republic there is so strong position, not only current government but also all parties in parliament, that is really very important issue when we have to be able to show that we are able in so difficult situation, we are able to prefer political discussion and political debate. And maybe in this thing, it seems to me that something has to be changed in Europe. And because of this danger of too technocratical approach, maybe in this, maybe Frans has a little bit different view, but you can take me like somebody who is very frank and deep pro-European, but at the same time I'm trying to represent people, and I have interest to have in Czech Republic people, decent percentage of people which are also pro-European. And you know that in this special item we are fighting a relatively complicated fight, because in Czech Republic we have only 32% people which are now on the side of Europe and strong pro-Europeans.
Okay, I'm all for a political debate, but surely I can then also ask in that political debate, to look at the reality and not to overstate the case of problems, and certainly not to go into the direction of scaremongering. Over the last decade, I think, or a bit longer ago, I don't know exactly on what time period, in Poland, for instance, they received tens of thousands of refugees, I think up to 80,000, from Chechnya, many of whom are Muslim. Did that change the Polish culture? Did that changed the nature of the Polish nation? Are there now ghettos of Chechens in major Polish cities? Don't think so. I think in your country you had, I don't know how many, but many Vietnamese, people from Southeast Asia coming in the 90s and even before. Has that changed the Czech nation in any way? Perhaps enriched it in terms of the cuisine, but it has not necessarily been an attack. So I think, we in my part of Europe, we created huge problems because of failed integration of migrant populations, labor migrants, coming in the 1960s and the 1970s with the assumption that they would go back again, so we neglected integration. And yes, we created problems in many inner cities, in France, in the United Kingdom, in the Netherlands, and we are struggling with that. But I think we should be honest about that, and that we have created a problem we need to solve, but you cannot equate that one-on-one with the situation of a couple of thousand of refugees that need in the short term to be accommodated in a member state. So yes, I'm all for a political debate, but then also give us the room to argue on the basis of these facts and not just on the basis of
if I may,
being afraid.
If I may react, Frans, I said that during 2016, Czech Republic was willing to receive 30,000 refugees, or no refugees, but migrants, but no, not refugees, migrants from.
And you mean within Europe? They came from other
European
from
the east, and but we have no suicide bombers between Ukrainians and Vietnamese. And if people are following or...
Has there been a suicide bomber yet from this refugee intake in the Czech Republic?
Yes, it's because we have nearly no refugees from the south, maybe, in this country. But if people listen that in the United Kingdom, after these last atrocities, they open public information that they have 3,500 extremists in the United Kingdom, and the police is not able to control the situation, it's something which is very difficult to argue and to discuss.
Yes, but again, that is a problem that is much older and is not linked one-on-one with the present refugee crisis. If you look at what is happening with who are the people that are the biggest threat, who are the people tempted by jihadism, these are people, second, third generation people born in our societies. These are people who went to fight with ISIS and are coming back, foreign terrorist fighters. These people are the real threat to our societies. And I find it very difficult to understand that if you can go in a refugee camp, let's say in Greece, you can select the people you want to select. You can check them, double check them, triple check them. These are people who fled the very ISIS terrorists that we are also fighting in our inner city. So I understand your point, and I fully understand. The people are worried, especially in societies like the Czech, where they have no experience with this phenomenon. And I fully respect, and they are right, that they shouldn't repeat the mistakes we have made, tragic mistakes we have made. But that is not one-on-one talking about the same people. I find it very difficult to take this argument to a Syrian mother who has fled with her children because she didn't want to be raped by an ISIS combatant who might have come from my country or the United Kingdom or somewhere else. So the only thing I want is to plead for some nuance in this debate. And then at the end of the day, weighing the arguments, you still don't feel you can go down that path. I have full respect for that. But let's have an open and honest debate about the facts and about the realities of refugees as well, because these are fellow human beings who I think deserve a safe refuge if they flee for this barbarism that the jihadis are inflicting upon them.
And let's bring in one last concrete question that follows on this, and it's from Teresa Novotna, and it gets us into that concrete territory where we're out of abstract EU and European value ideas and into hard realities. Are there trade-offs here? Brexit is going to bring less money into the EU budget. Is there a scenario where you would accept less money from the EU in exchange for less refugees from an EU relocation system?
I would like not to have trade-off in this issue. It seems
but we do have a trade-off in this issue. It's coming.
It seems to me a bad idea because we have to find solution. Compromise is something different than this kind of trade-off. Maybe I am looking forward that we have long time to discuss many of these complicated things, but I would like to have real consensus because similar trade-off. It is very important what kind of Europe will be the end of this discussions, and this type of procedures are not right.
But this is the same thing as saying, if you don't do what I want, I will shoot myself in the foot. Because I mean, if we make policies that delay convergence of the European economy, we all suffer. So the structural funds aren't gifts from one part of Europe to the other part of Europe. The structural funds are a collective engagement to make sure that we have convergence in Europe. And one of the biggest challenges in today's Europe is that we don't have enough convergence. And that's why too many people are left behind. There is divergence between rich and poor. There's divergence between north and south. Not between east and west, there's convergence there, but there's too much divergence in the EU. And punishing through structural funds is increasing divergence instead of promoting convergence. So it would be a very strong double barrel shot in your own foot if you would do that.
I think on that note, we have to wrap it up. I'm very sorry, I would love to talk about this all day long, but I can see the organizers willing to jump on us on the stage and almost tackle us off here. So on that note, I want to thank both of you for a very interesting discussion. It's certainly not the end of the debate, so I'm pretty sure we can continue this online and in future forums. I want to thank all of you for joining us here for this conference, and now we invite the organizers up for brief closing remarks. And if we just stay here on stage for 1 minute.
I would like also thank you, Frans, for coming to Prague. Very well, thank you.
Yes.